So let me I've been asked to talk very briefly about what I think we will be discussing at the very end as well, so maybe to set the stage and talk about my own interest in these questions. And I think this title essentially does summarize what I want to talk about and what this conference, I hope, will talk about. So what I want to talk about is something that Chris already alluded to, which is we know from a lot of work that the importance of early life conditions and family environments has received a tremendous amount of evidence and empirical support from a number of disciplines that sometimes are not fully talking to each other, integrating. One hope that we have at HCEO is that there will actually be more to stir the pot, if you will, and we can create more dialogue across disciplines. So this is a main goal. Now, in particular, and the emphasis has been made, and I think there will be a lot of papers today and tomorrow on health, although I don't want to speak specifically to health. So I just want to talk very, very briefly. And when I say what I'm going to talk today, right now, is somewhat related to what we're going to conclude with, because Jerry Berman will be talking about interventions, and I'm going to talk about interventions. But I'm also going to talk about the interpretation of these interventions and how we might go forward and how this conference could help. So we know that early life factors seem to be important determinants of health. And in fact, the World Health Organization has actually sought an overall goal of 25% reduction in preventable non-communicable diseases by 2025. But most of the focus, to be honest, and I think this is changing, but I think it's still out there, has been on adults and trying to manage health. If you think about healthcare, even if you think about health economics, most of the discussion about it has been about how to improve healthcare delivery systems for adults, how we can essentially prevent disease. And children are certainly brought into the mix, but there is no kind of logical sequence thinking about different stages of the life cycle. And that's what I think this conference is about, how early life conditions shape later life conditions. So here I'm just going to show you an example. This is from some old work I did with Gabriella Conti, but this just gives you an example of what we know, some differences by males and females, about a variety of outcomes, not just health, but healthy behaviors and things like employment and wages, but also strong education gradients. And in a very crude calculation, what we tried to do, and this is like aggregating, so it's by male and female, and it's aggregating over a number of more basic causes, but just if you're willing to talk about the causal effect of education, if you break the life cycle up into a component where you're taking the first 5, 6, 7 years, early life conditions, then say what are the additional causal effects of education beyond that, you can see substantial causal effects of education on some of these different dimensions, but also an important role played by early life factors. And so this conference we're going to discuss, I think, this and a variety of other factors, and I hope we will anyway. So this is kind of my wish list for what will happen the next 2 days. And so I think we want to look at the causes and mechanisms of developmental inequalities in health and human capital. And so I think one key thing that I hope we can take out of the conference is to move beyond the typical discussion about disadvantage, where disadvantage is usually talked about poverty or very generally adversity or some measure of disadvantage more generally, to thinking about what the mechanisms are within the family. What aspects of family life play an important role? The attachment, the notion of stimulation, nutrition, and things that are all on the discussion, and early life conditions, even prenatal conditions. And so I like to use this picture here as a framework of my own model of how I hope this literature evolves, and I think the literature has partly evolved, where we imagine starting out in early life at conception, and imagine how different factors play into each other. So you can call this whatever you want to. This diagram essentially captures a lot of different approaches, thinking about not only genetic characteristics, but also about aspects of investment, family behavior, and environments. But the question is, what are the critical stages and for what outcomes, and where is it effective at all to intervene in the life cycle to imagine we actually produce successful adult lives? So I think this approach goes well beyond the kind of standard deterministic techniques, well beyond, I think, what has been talked about in terms of sort of deterministic models about genetics and so forth, but to consider aspects, for example, of biology, developmental plasticity, and the like. So this is the key goal. There's a very nice paper that was just circulated. I don't know if you got that, Bert, by Terry Moffat on looking at the Dunedin study, just the most recent version of it, where she basically was summing up all of these genetic scores and showing long-term effects on things like health, but also on education and a number of other components. No particular gene was playing a dominant role, but the accumulation of all these genes was playing an enormous role, and she did some mediation analyses. So that's very much in the spirit of this and going forward in terms of trying to really understand the structure of environments. Let me just talk very briefly about some of the own work that I've done here, just because I think it's consistent, and just to I think I'll throw out some ideas that I hope we'll discuss in greater detail. This is some work that I did with Steve Sumi, Gabriella Conti, Stephen Cole, and a number of other people. But this is basically the rhesus monkey experiment lab that was set up at NIH for many years, and Stephen Sumi has been conducting these. These are the evolution from Harlow's monkeys. And basically, in this study, we could follow, because they were animals, or he could follow, and we helped with the analysis, monkeys being raised into one of three rearing conditions: mother-reared, peer-reared, and surrogate peer-reared, so raised with a surrogate mother. And then we could, since these are animals, we could randomize them, and we could remove the animals from their mothers at birth. They were raised in nurseries under different conditions. And so what was able, so in this paper we published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and this is the full list of authors, what we found, and I think we'll hear more discussion of this, is differential gene expression. This is just in certain areas where we actually can see that among the surrogate peer-reared monkeys versus the mother-reared monkeys, there was definitely some notion of inflammation. We had differentiation and so forth. So this is the sense in which the environments, literally in this case, documented environments, got under the skin. And then the second natural question, which could be answered with the monkey populations, was can the effects of adverse early conditions be reversed by a normal social environment later? And we had a follow-up paper, again with more or less the same cast of characters. And what we did is looked at effects on physical and mental health, such as we could measure it over a lifetime. And what you can see, these are veterinary records, so we have very complete longitudinal data, which we put together for the first time. And you can see that there were substantial differences, especially between the surrogate peer-reared monkeys and the mother-reared monkeys. If you looked at measures of various kinds of behavior, you saw substantial differences too in the sense of developing various kinds of pathologies in terms of behaviors. And if you looked at the gaps, I mean, I'm not trying to compare humans to monkeys, but we think that the animal studies do have some light, and I hope that's one question we can talk about in the next 2 days, that we get kind of similar patterns in terms of disadvantaged environments. This is a diagram that I hope we discuss, and it's around very much in the current discussion. It goes back to an old graph that Charles Nelson and Thompson did maybe some 15 years ago about critical and sensitive periods. And this was their schematic for thinking about, this is an old diagram, it's come under substantial attack and has been revised, and it's in the process of revision, but I hope we can think about it. And this is a very crude kind of categorical notion about when skills develop. Where in that life cycle chart we see skill development. And so let me just talk very briefly, if I can. You can stop me at any time. You're the chair, I guess. So Bert, I can spend the rest of the day. He wrote such. Okay, no. But I will. Do I have how much time? 10 minutes, fine. I don't need more than that. So I want to talk. So a lot of the work in social science, I'm an economist, has been on aspects of behavior, not so fine as the genetic level, the neuronal level. What we've looked at a lot is some measures, and even there, the measures are relatively new for work in social science. So cognition, we've talked about a lot. Aspects about character, what sometimes have been called grit or the big 5 characteristics and so forth, these have been shown to be very important, and important in the sense of understanding not only what lifetime success is, going beyond the standard emphasis on IQ and on achievement test scores, but also in understanding how these interventions are actually working when we talk about early childhood interventions. And then also health. So there's a lot of research in economics looking at the biological architecture, and thinking about new ways to measure skills. Bert was here for a year ago. We had a conference just on how new systems about using behaviors in games, interaction, both in laboratory games and in computer games, to try to extract what have been traditionally measured, measures traits that come from pencil and paper questionnaires, which is, I think, becoming more and more obsolete as a way of measuring. And so this is really the dynamics that I was talking about, and this is a very rough schematic. And I hope we can actually fill this in and have some notion about where we stand in terms of how these different skills interact. It's not a single skill, not just IQ, measures of intelligence. Each of these, we have a much more nuanced understanding. But we know from a lot of the studies, the gaps in terms of achievement scores open up very early, between the early years, age 3 to age 18. This is a study taken from Gina Brooks-Gunn, but there are other studies very analogous to this. These are age-standardized scores, but what we see is the gaps by mother's education. They're there at 18 or more or less there at age 5, certainly by age 3. And you get similar gaps, although in reverse order, on socio-emotional skills. And again, another iconic study. I don't want to bore everybody here, but this is the standard study, and it's been reaffirmed in many later studies and refined, that the early life environments of these disadvantaged children are substantial. But then this is a dimension of trying to understand what adversity is. To what extent is it language and language exposure, and then the process of interaction, which builds attachment, may supplement attachment, and so forth. But this is the open question, and we still see people talking about these questions. So no two alike. We see a lot of popular books suggesting that genes are really quite important, and in fact genetic determination is important. So then I think what we want to try to understand, and I mentioned this Terry Moffat paper, but there are many other papers in this literature, of which a list is given here, some partial list, that we really do want to go beyond it, but we don't want to ignore it either. And so this is, again, and I'm just putting up the iconic pictures to kind of stimulate your memories, not to tell you anything new. And this is the substantial difference in the methylation patterns between these are all identical twins, one twin on the left, another twin on the right. The group on the left is age 3, the other group is age 50. And so you can see that even though they have identical genetic material, they have fundamentally different gene expression, which we know plays an important role. So that's the really important question. And then the issue is dynamic complementarity. The extent to which, if there are some early life disadvantages, are there ways both in early life and so what those disadvantages are, what it actually we mean by disadvantage, and then asking the larger question about whether or not how important those early advantages are, do they propagate, or the early disadvantages are, and what would be the effectiveness. But one thing that's come out of the economics literature, which I think is extremely important, is finding that in many cases one can build an argument, both on theoretical grounds and on empirical grounds, that the standard kind of trade-off you hear in public policy discussions about equity and efficiency, equality and efficiency, it really isn't a big trade-off here, in the sense that early life interventions seem to reduce inequality, promote social mobility, and actually have high economic returns. And so this is what you wanted me to talk about. That was literally it. So here I'm responding. And this is a graph which is a theoretical construct, but it has received a lot of empirical support. Namely that it seems like early life programs play a very important role. Now remember what this diagram is. This is a hypothetical construct. And this is basically taking a child, in literally a fetus, if you will, and asking the question, if we ask where is the first dollar most productively spent over the life cycle, we can see that it's in the early years. This is not an empirical statement. It's saying that job training has no return, nothing of the sort. What it is saying is that precisely because you build skill bases, and this is an idea that's shown up in numerous literatures, you build skill bases, it propagates through the life cycle. It's not just that it's earlier and therefore can be harvested longer, it actually makes people more capable for exploiting all the subsequent opportunities that come along the way. And so there's a large literature documenting that. So let me, if I have a minute, to talk about a couple of interventions. What, 5 minutes, 2 minutes? Okay, fine. So let me just talk about a couple of interventions which I've been involved with now, although I didn't start these. And one of the most iconic is, of course, the Perry Preschool Project, which was started some 50 years ago now, and on which we now have data. We have the data collected for these children at age 55 with measures of health. So we're actually able now to go further than what was done in the past. These were disadvantaged kids. They've been followed for 50 years. It was a randomized controlled trial. And it was relatively modest, started at age 3. And the interesting thing was that even though it raised IQ initially, treatment and control, it had very little lasting effect on IQ. But if we compute economic rates of return, very substantial. And the way it worked was primarily through non-cognitive channels, or what I mean, this is a coarse aggregate of ideas. But the idea being, it's actually promoting individuals who, this is less externalizing behavior, essentially producing less externalizing behavior and some other measures about academic motivation. And if we just decompose the treatment effects, we see that the non-cognitive dimensions, the ones that have frequently been neglected, things that are, I think, arise from factors I hope we discuss today, but I think have to do with attachment and sort of emotional relationships. But we see long-term effects on health. And then to conclude, the Carolina ABC project is basically a project which, again, we've just completed an analysis. And again, we're starting to follow these people up to age 45. This was done some 40 years ago in North Carolina, more intensive. It consisted also of health screening visits. Kids started at 8 weeks. They were in this program for 5 years, and we could follow them. And there were biweekly visits with individual tutoring at later years, but not in the early years, but a lot of parents coming into the centers. And so what were the results? Lasting effects on IQ, improved parenting practices, child attachment, and positive effect on female behavior and mental health. And so if you just look at the health benefits, this is from a paper we published in Science 2 years ago, you can see substantial effects. And the last column is what you should look at. That adjusts for all of the standard issues on multiple hypothesis testing using Romano and Wolf. And what you find is substantial benefits, more for males than females, by the way. And this is something that shows up repeatedly in a number of studies. Substantial health effects in terms of cardiovascular health, in terms of obesity, and in terms of hypertension and so forth. So definitely real advantages. And so I will just conclude, I guess I should, with this graph here. So if you translate this and just convert it, and this is what economists are good at, I guess it's our comparative advantage, although we do other things. When we actually look at this, what the life cycle benefits are of these early interventions, what we see is substantial cost. This program cost $80,000 per participant. So by many standards, this is way out of sight. But if you look at, so that's the 80,000 there, it gives you a measure of the scale. That's the first figure at the bottom. I'm breaking it out by males and females, but here, just look at the pool, the box, the big box with the dot in the center. And so there's a big cost. But if you look at the present value of benefits over the whole life cycle, substantial total benefits arising through labor income, through parental income. So you're subsidizing childcare, and with that, promoting mothers working. And then also reduced crime, primarily for males, and improved quality of life through health care, through health life. So basically, we get substantial benefits. And so I won't go, these are quite robust, I should point out. We can break out different components. I just don't have time to do it today. I can send anybody a copy of the paper. But these results hold up. You get 11, 12% rates of return if you pool them together, males and females, and separate returns by males and females. And these other rows are basically showing how the returns hold up if we drop completely components associated with each of those outcomes. So this is a robustness study. But just to conclude, and I will conclude with this, and this is what I think is relevant for the topic of the conference, is how did this program actually work? And this is why I think is related to maternal. So I don't want to just say, here's a program, and now we'll talk about mothering, and those are two orthogonal descriptions. No, I see what these programs doing is providing surrogate mothering. They're actually supplementing the family. And the question is how exactly those mechanisms work. So for every parental intervention, for other aspects of parenting, I see an aspect here of where the programs have actually changed the relationship between the mother and the child. So we actually can measure these. These are videotapes that were taken on the ABC children. And again, there are a lot of numbers there, so you can take a look at it. And there's some sharp differences by gender, favoring females now in this case here. But what you actually find by measures of interactions that are taken early on in life, and then this translates into later life outcomes, we see substantial increase in things like reading, playing with toy, and essentially engagement with the child, and a substantial change in the parenting style. And so that would be the question that I have, is how this conference, not that your goal here is to interpret the ABC data, but I think looking at maternal interventions and thinking about interventions generally, what we're really doing, I think, is supplementing what families do. And so an understanding what we're doing is to really understand exactly what families do and exactly how these programs might operate in most effective way. That just seems like a logical framework. And so here are some other measures of maternal warmth and so forth. Again, stronger for, and so nutritional programs we'll hear about tomorrow, I hope, from Jerry, right? So I was going to talk about Jamaica and I was going to talk about INCAP, but I hope you'll talk about that. So anyway, so let me just conclude. This is what I was going to talk about. So summary, a substantial portion of late life disparities have origins in early life. That's what I think we all agree, or at least maybe we won't agree. We think that there are critical and sensitive periods, but the terms are used loosely at this point. And the question is for what skills and what's the capacity for resilience and remediation? While children can be damaged, the damage can also be remediated. And so I don't want to stop with a notion of determinism that starts saying it's all over by age 5. No, there are effective interventions at later life years, but they typically look at dimensions of social and emotional skills. So I think we really want to think about where we might go. And so I would end with some questions, okay, which complements, I think, your questions, Chris. So what are the critical periods in human behavior, and for what skills and behaviors? And do some shocks matter more than others? And the question is, even are the biological mechanisms the same across different species? In some work that we've done recently, just published, with some Chinese twins, we found even though that children had severe health shocks, some other than one twin had a health shock, the other didn't, the parental response played a huge role. And it played a huge role in the sense that the kid who was affected obviously got more resources for health care, but we also found that that same affected child was receiving fewer resources for education. So there were margins of adjustment. So it isn't just the pure biology, it's also how the parents are reacting. And there were substantial differences by males and females. And then, and I hope we hear from this, I know it's on the program, how quantitatively important are epigenetic effects? Unfortunately, Jablonka could not join us. I talked with her in Tel Aviv last May, had a very productive conversation. And of course, she's somewhat skeptical and hard-nosed in her thinking. But the question is, how important are these? I gave you a very, very simple example from the monkey study data. There are some studies that are underway, and I hope we can hear about those, because the genetic explanation, however, if you look at the behavioral genetics, people are still arguing like 50%, I think, is the standard heritability figure, although it's modified by environment in a way that's not completely interpretable. So I don't want to get off on that right now. But anyway, if you take the results in the literature, even that behavioral genetics expression can be reduced to like 20%, but genes are still there. And then where are interventions most effective? And that's where I'd ask the question, where is mothering and where are parenting and environmental factors most important? So I'll stop with that. I'm really looking forward. I hope at the end I will ask every one of you to answer these questions so that I can go off and then try to understand the data in social science. But I think it's a great opportunity for us to exchange ideas. And I know we have different disciplinary backgrounds, and that's what HCEO is all about, is trying to put together what individuals, different styles. So anyway, thank you very much, and I really hope that we can gain some useful dialogue. Here's the